And also, I think it does point out that the kind of radical vision that's being promoted by and kind of entering the mainstream of people like Yarvin and others is something that is sort of next level. Like it's kind of going beyond. It's not about reforming or reinventing the institutions we have. It's about just shoving them aside and replacing it with something dramatically different. And I would argue replacing it with things that actually I'm not quite clear how they're going to build them. Like there's only so much a tech billionaire can do.
What if the tech industry we built on the West Coast is no longer on our side? How could people on the West Coast reassert their dominion over the companies that very often exist because of public support, and yet power West Coast state and local economies? What about reining in the handful of childish tech billionaires whose historic wealth has led them to accumulate and wield power without accountability? Tech in the West Coast is an all-time great love story, chiefly responsible for making our region on the West Coast the third largest economy in the world behind the rest of the US and China. Yet, oligarchy has found a home in Silicon Valley, and oligarchs bankrolled a dictator who's making a mockery of our first principles while crushing the government agencies that make Silicon Valley what it is. We could all use a history lesson. I'm joined this episode by historian Margaret O'Mara. Margaret's one of the most insightful chroniclers of Silicon Valley and the political economy it shaped. She's a professor at the University of Washington and author of The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. She's clear-eyed, compassionate, rigorous, and just fun to talk to. Just what we need to help make sense of this moment when our tech titans are turning on democracy and our innovation economy challenges national policy. Welcome to Pacific Time, the podcast where we ask the big what-if questions about the future of the West Coast, its challenges, its opportunities, and the potential for independence, or at least autonomy. I'm your host, Greg Amrofell. I kicked off my conversation with Margaret just after President Trump marked 100 days in his second term, and I asked her, how is the relationship between big tech and West Coast governments evolving in the wake of so much national tumult?
State and city governments, that's a good question. Yeah, so much of the attention has been on Washington, D.C. lately. You know, we were coming out of a number of years in which certainly in California, in Northern California, at the top of the tech food chain, there was much complaint about the state of the cities and San Francisco in particular, kind of pushback against progressive governance. There's been, to some degree, some of that observable in high-tech capitals like Seattle and Portland and LA as well. But I think there also has been, it's very interesting. There's been a lot of attention given to the new allies of Donald Trump at the very top of the tech pyramid, these very, very wealthy investors and entrepreneurs, the billionaire class. But, by and large, the rank and file tech world are still voting pretty blue and probably looking to state and local leaders in the West Coast states to stand up and stand apart from the Trump administration. I think it's all just been moving so fast, and it's all in the backdrop of Liberation Day tariffs that may or may not, unclear kind of to what degree that's going to shape the landscape for tech. But for an export-oriented West Coast, it is serious business. And I think it's very hard to kind of see through the glass darkly right now and figure out what's going to be, what the future lies, what are going to be the upsides, what are going to be the downsides, not only for the business, but just for the ecosystem of these high-tech places.
What would you say are the surprising signs of accommodation on one hand and resistance on the other? I'm thinking of things like DEI and the Gulf of America and the tariffs as well.
Yeah. Gavin Newsom's podcast.
Say more.
Seems to have been, taking this approach of if you can't beat them, join them, or at least try to understand them, and launched a podcast where he was interviewing figures such as Steve Bannon. I mean, that's kind of one tack that the so-called left coast politicians have taken. There's another, or Democrats in general, there's another which has been to, and I think there's more and more of a, fuller and fuller throated resistance. I think that what's becoming clear is that this was a flood the zone 100 days, so much that, deliberately flooding with so much that it was hard to figure out what to react to when. But what is emerging is that it is institutions that are under assault, and there are institutions under assault that probably didn't imagine they would be under assault quite as assiduously. Big law firms, for example, that they are, acting alone. They are not going to win. They're not going to win either against a very demanding administration or in the court of public opinion. And that banding together, there is more power. And so I think that, we've seen this in my realm of higher education, where universities, which are very slow-moving battleships, mind you, it is very difficult for these large, these very large organizations, and policy making is very slow and deliberate. But the fact that you have so many university presidents who have kind of signed on to a shared set of principles to say, we're going to stand together on this, where you have things like the Big Ten Compact. My University of Washington is now part of the Big Ten. We're all still adjusting to that weirdness. But the 18 Big Ten universities are at the faculty level, and I think also with the administrative level, kind of banding together to say an attack on one is attack on all. And that's pretty significant. That's kind of like similar to why, West Coast states, when they are acting as a bloc, are together as, a significant economic and political force as most countries in the world, or nearly all countries in the world. So too are American institutions. When they are not acting singly, there might be more power. But these are just, so much of this is uncharted waters. Everything from the Silicon Valley moguls on the inaugural dais to the multiple attacks on the foundations of the innovation economy in higher education and immigration policy and all the things that kind of drove American innovation generally, and also particularly West Coast innovation of the last 80 years. Like, those are the things that are now being very deliberately and, chaotically, but very dramatically under attack. And the dismantlement is, the harm is real, and it's going to be hard to reverse.
Philosophically, the West Coast could be seen as certainly the seat of resistance to Trump on one hand, and yet, and you mentioned it with your reference to the inauguration, many leaders out of the tech industry, which you've studied so closely, have become key funders and enablers of Trump 2.0. How do you reconcile these?
There is a lot about 2025 that I didn't have on my bingo card as a historian of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. And yet, I don't have to convince everyone that politics and tech have something to do with one another. That actually, these are two very closely connected worlds. On the one hand, you can see the stepping to the Trump side as something that is we've seen in most presidential administrations. A new guy comes in, and leaders of large companies want to stay in the White House's good graces. We saw a very strong alliance between the tech world, the West Coast tech world, and the White House with the election of Barack Obama in 2008 into his first administration. So that isn't completely new. I think that what is new and surprising is this kind of allegiance and support of Trump by individuals who 8 years ago, when Trump was first elected, were outspoken about the danger that he posed, and not just to the country, but to their businesses. And I think the difference here is there's a business difference. What's happened in the last 8 years of tech? Well, they've been pretty buffo, great 8 years. Not only did the fears that Silicon Valley leaders have about a first Trump administration in 2016, 2017, not only did those not really come to pass in terms of, the lack of access to foreign-born workers or the, cutting off of innovative capacity, that didn't happen. And in fact, there were times of absolutely extraordinary growth of not only these technology companies, but of the personal fortunes of the people who founded and invested in them. And so they're like, okay, so we don't see the harms that we feared before. And we also see the very real harms in opposing Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos spent, 4 years as a Twitter piñata with Trump kind of saying mean things about him because of his ownership of the Washington Post. And with AWS, Amazon Web Services, losing extraordinarily lucrative Pentagon contracts because Donald Trump was mad at him. And so there was a real business damage. And Bezos is no longer CEO of Amazon, although his fortune is mostly in Amazon stock. But he also is the founder and CEO of Blue Origin, the space exploration company that is now running a distant second to Elon Musk's SpaceX in federal contracts. And so Bezos is a good example of there's a business reason too here. Mark Zuckerberg, there's a business reason. Last summer in 2024, Trump was threatening to throw Zuckerberg in prison for life. And so there was a concern about the damage to his business and the regulatory threats and the antitrust lawsuits. Now, that's one dimension of it. But the other one, I think, is very personal and actually cultural, political, and it comes through in the, podcast interviews that these CEOs are giving, that they feel that, the Democrats did them wrong, that after years of praise and support and you are changing the world for the better, the last 10 years has been one of very harsh criticism, including from former Democratic allies. And the Biden administration was tough on tech in the way that the Obama administration was not. And that was something that was that these guys didn't like, and also felt, we did our best to try and meet your critiques and address them, and yet you still criticize us relentlessly. And then I think there's sort of this sharp, politics of the, call it the manosphere, call it, anti-wokeism, whatever it is, has a great appeal to these kind of iconoclastic or self-styled iconoclasts. Another thing they're pretty resentful about is all the demands that their employees have been making over the last 5-6 years about more equity, more diversity, more fairness. They see this as, again, a distraction from the core business of building tech and this unfair criticism of what they do. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon, this kind of outspoken, there's always been political alliances between business and government. This ain't new. But the really outspoken, sharp-edged political speech and endorsements and really wading in, neck deep, or in the case of Elon Musk, kind of the full immersion bath of Doge, that is not something that we've seen in tech history before, or American business history for that matter.
Yeah. So, I think you're hinting at both a kind of business opportunistic side to this, both in terms of, opportunities to do federal government work, but also to prevent the feds from getting in your way as a business. You're hinting at kind of some personal hurt over issues, cultural issues that these leaders have been wrestling with in their employee base. I also detect a strain of, kind of a different worldview emerging. And I'm thinking of people like Curtis Yarvin and the way Elon Musk in particular seems to be advancing a very different view that's not just about business opportunity and, upset over wokeism. What's going on there? And is there precedent for this in the history of the tech industry?
It's really interesting because, thinkers like Yarvin, the, neo-monarchist, hey, kings are good, actually, were really fringe thinkers for a while, even within the tech world, and now have become much more kind of mainstreamed, in part because some of these kind of self-styled contrarians and iconoclasts, not only Musk, but also his former PayPal compatriot, Peter Thiel, who notably was the one, really prominent Silicon Valley type who spoke at the 2016 Republican convention and endorsed Trump when no one else wanted to go near him. So there's, an ascent of these sort of OG Silicon Valley conservatives. So on one hand, people like Thiel have been around for a while and thinking that way for a while. They haven't changed their stripes. And there has been this core group of thinkers and investors, many of them associated in some way with the PayPal mafia, the group of people who became wealthy through PayPal in the early aughts. One thing that really connects us to a much older and much more widespread and persistent philosophy of tech is this kind of technology will win, technology above all. Government is a bureaucracy to be shoved aside, and we need to free ourselves from the bounds of nation states. It is a philosophy that expresses itself in 1996 through John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which is this famous techno-libertarian coming from the left. I mean, Barlow was famously a Grateful Dead lyricist. He always had that as part of his bio, as well as a founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which was fighting from the start for, net neutrality and free speech on the internet. So coming from a different place. But the techno-optimistic notion of we can build tech and we can make the world better through tech, I mean, that's got deep roots. That goes back to, let's dial our way back to the 60s and 70s and these first home brewers in garages playing around building personal computers and talking about personal liberation through desktop computing and personal expression. And you're going to tear down gatekeepers. And this was the promise of the internet, too. It was going to, throw the wide world all open, connect the world, advance democracy, free speech, all of these positive affirmative values. And so in some ways, like they're actually, when you think about, the progress from the, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in the garage making the first Apple I in the 70s, and John Perry Barlow in the 90s talking about the cyberspace being independent of governments, of old governments of iron and steel. You have no place here. That's how the declaration begins. And then you get to someone like Yarvin, and you get to Musk and Doge, Doge is a chaotic dismantling of the government because the chaos is part of the point. They don't care about preserving functionality. This isn't about strategy. Like there was a lot of commentary about like, well, there is waste to be cut. And if only they did this a little more thoughtfully. And like, no, that's not what they're here for. They don't care if any of it works. They don't think it should work. And that actually has pretty deep roots and kind of cuts across the spectrum and is something that just animates a lot of tech. And has a lot of proof points in its favor. Like I'm sitting here talking to you with a supercomputer on my wrist, aka an Apple Watch, that, pretty darn cool what, we've been able to produce over the last 80 years. It's kind of nuts. So you can see why they're pretty proud of their innovative capacities. Ironically, a lot of the, foundational technologies that are going to this supercomputer on my wrist were things that came from government funding that's now being dismantled and hobbled by Doge. But, we'll get to that.
So many threads we could pull on. And by the way, a story, I think back, I was an undergrad in DC in the early 90s. And I remember when Apple at the time was coming out with its first laptops, I remember unfolding this gorgeous trifold ad in our school newspaper that was a person sitting on the top of Half Dome in Yosemite with a PowerBook in her lap. And I was like, that was really enticing, wasn't it?
Yeah. Liberation through information, right? Think different. Like also, you are special because you use these machines and this is going to just make you an even better you. Like that's, and that individualism too, I think is another through line in all of this, right? It's like everyone out for themselves. It's, Ayn Rand rules the world. That is again, this sort of, there's a positive affirmative individualism of empowerment through technology. And that's something that courses through, the Clinton administration's efforts to wire schools to the internet of the 1990s and saying, this is going to fix educational inequality. Yeah, that's a nice idea. But it is the same thing that also powers like, oh, we should have cryptocurrency, not fiat currency. Like get the government out of this, get regulators out of this. Let's have, sovereign states that are run by tech moguls, not actual nation states that are run by democratically elected lawmakers. Like there's the through line. And so that's, I think, helpful in part because it shows, some of this isn't that new. And also, I think it does point out that the kind of radical vision that's being promoted by and kind of entering the mainstream of, people like Yarvin and others is something that is sort of next level. Like it's kind of going beyond. It's not about reforming or reinventing the institutions we have. It's about just shoving them aside and replacing it with something dramatically different. And I would argue replacing it with things that actually I'm not quite clear how they're going to build them. Like, there's only so much a tech billionaire can do. Believe it or not, they don't know everything about everything.
No, it's crossed my mind that what we're watching is the wish fulfillment of the small government era Reagan Republicans.
Yeah,
but in ways that would have horrified Ronald Reagan.
Yes,
because I think there was ultimately a belief in civil society that ran through that rhetoric anyway. And it strikes me that now you've got these people with a lot of influence and a lot of money who are basically saying democracy as we know it might be an outmoded technology.
Yes, it's a very small group of people with a lot of money and influence. And this is also a function of this hyper concentration of wealth. hyperaccumulation of wealth, hyper inequality. Like we were talking 10 years ago about inequality in America, right? Thomas Piketty, his book came out and everyone carried it around and pretended to read it. It was really big. But now, like you look at the growth charts of the Fortune's concentration of personal wealth, and particularly in the hands of, we're talking like 25 people or less in Silicon Valley. By Silicon Valley, I mean kind of, West Coast American tech. Generally, like it's not that many people. And of the people who are sort of that wealthy and the ones who are clustering around Trump, it's just not that many. Yet they have a huge influence at the moment. And also platform concentration. You have a few companies that have, that are all racing to build AI. So AI is now the defining technology of the age. Not to say that they sort of made it up out of thin air, but there is a cycle that has been, hype that has been generated around the real thing that is in part because you just have a few platform companies pouring as much money as they can, and they can pour a lot of money into the next generation.
It strikes me that if the majority of Americans voted primarily for a wrecking ball on the current system because it wasn't working for them, they got what they wanted. But there was not much of an articulation about what we're heading toward. Do you detect in any of the sort of tech influence in government a notion of what we're heading toward?
I don't. I mean, I think those that are thinking about it, they want to see sort of a tech utopia where government regulation is replaced by private regulation, where people are opting into, again, it's sort of an Ayn Rand paradise, where people are opting into services and frameworks that are provided by private companies and private entrepreneurs, and where there are not restraints on individual behavior or achievement, and that presumes that meritocracy will win, that we are in a meritocracy, and that, one of the really important things to remember is that these tech leaders are extraordinarily successful and very, very, very good at one thing. They're really good. No one's going to dispute that they're good at running tech companies, or that they're business success stories. You might say, like, there was luck, there was contingency. I mean, it's true for all of us, every last one of us, right? There's always like luck and timing and, other conditions that enable individual success. And every company is successful not because of the one or two people who founded it, but the cast of thousands that enabled it to be great, right? That was one of the things I tried to do in my book, was show the story of companies like Apple and Microsoft and be like, yeah, and it's the people and also all these people you never heard of that helped make it what it is. It's yes and both. But these individuals who have been very successful and have become very wealthy because of that, what has happened, it's sort of very distinctive to tech, that, we kind of had in this several decades of really building up these entrepreneurs as American heroes. There was also a great kind of valorization and endorsement of engineering thinking more broadly, that what society needs is better engineering. This kind of really crests at the beginning, the first decade or so of this century. You have the rise of Google, sort of the engineering thinking of Google and others. If the world were run by computer scientists, it would be clean, less messy, more logical, more efficient. And something that was kind of that kind of know-how, Silicon Valley know-how, was celebrated and encouraged by the presidency of Barack Obama, where, we had a great example of the government needed some good tech support remember healthcare.gov, when that was first rolled out after Obamacare was passed, this disastrous website. And they literally brought in Silicon Valley leaders for tech support to redo it. And but this kind of being told from a very young, first becoming successful at a very young age, when you've done one thing, you've done a lot of coding in your childhood bedroom and in your dorm room, and then you suddenly make it big. And everyone's like, you're a genius. You do everything right. You enter this bubble of wealth and privilege, where you have a lot of people who are on your payroll telling you you're awesome, and other people who are very wealthy around you, and you're living, a different life than most people. And then the world is like, well, can you take all of that amazing engineering know-how and then apply it to the other things? If you're so good at this, you must be good at that. And what's really played out pretty dramatically in the last 10 years is, for one, old Twitter, created this really powerful platform for these smart, thoughtful people and tech investors and entrepreneurs to start opining on issues of the day that didn't have to do with tech. And some of them started podcasts, very successful ones, right? Where they started off talking about business and the things that they do and investment advice. And then kind of as the world became more and more political, they became more and more political. And they started having strong opinions about, well, this is the way things should work. So this is my, really getting to your question of what's the end game here. I don't think they know what the end game is because they aren't policymakers. They aren't policy wonks. They don't know what policy implementation involves. So they may be very good at dismantlement and perhaps at kind of replacing it with something that will continue to make their fortunes secure, if not even greater. They're sort of in the self-interest, in their own sort of direct interest, but something that would replace it, that would be a new type of, a new political economy. I just don't think there's not the thinking or the capacity there. And they kind of don't feel it's quite their job. They kind of come in, they're there to disrupt and reinvent and then get back to business, not to stick around. I mean, even Elon's going home, right? They're not there for the long term.
What are the special societal considerations around tech and government moving forward?
Oh, gosh. There are a lot, and it's a difficult one because, the argument put forth against tech regulation of any kind, including AI regulation, is that the tech moves so fast and government moves so slow, and there's just always this temporal mismatch, and you're just going to have, ham-handed legislation that is not addressing the problem and that actually cuts off innovation. And I think that the dilemma, where we are right now, and one of the, offshoots of this kind of concentration of power in a few platform companies, who thus far the AI era has reinforced that power rather than kind of created new entrants. It's something of a contrast to, say, the dot-com era, where you had a whole bunch of new players come in. Some of them, boomed and bust, but some of them were Amazon. So there's an interesting stasis thus far because you kind of have to be playing with one of the big guys to play in AI right now. So you not only have a hyper concentration of cash and platform dominance of a few companies, you have a hyper concentration of talent and know-how in not only a few companies, but the private sector generally. So I think one of the real challenges to meaningful tech regulation for the last 15 years has been the giant sucking sound that is Facebook, Google, Amazon, all these big companies offering huge packages to academic researchers and government regulators or would-be government regulators who are like, I think I will go work there, or I'm not going to go work at the FTC. I'm not going to go work at the University of Washington. And so there's a real imbalance of knowledge. And that, I think, also makes it doubly hard to find a way to meaningfully regulate in a way that is attentive to the technology and is a few steps ahead of where it sort of sees where it's going. It, in a way, exacerbates the issue that people in the industry always complain about government regulators and lawmakers is like not understanding how their products work. That being said, I think there are a lot of really, really smart and savvy people, staff members in Congress, in the state legislatures, who get it and know a lot more than the companies want.
What's revealed by West Coast utopian experiments that have been hatched by tech leaders? And I'm thinking of things like the Cascadia Corridor, which Microsoft's Brad Smith is very actively advocating, kind of connecting Portland up to Vancouver through Seattle. And on the other hand, California Forever, which was this like dream state kind of community that was going to be built on the Sacramento Delta by tech millionaires and billionaires.
I actually think those are two really good examples of kind of two strains of tech thinking about politics and policy that I think has been persistent for a long time. On the one hand, Cascadia is kind of the, let's put it in the reinventing government family, that's a little hat tip to Al Gore. It's kind of based on, okay, we have existing institutions, and let's bring some really innovative thinking and tech know-how and good software and hardware and technological audacity to these institutions and think about them differently and make them work better. That's the spirit that informed the Obama era partnership between Washington, D.C. and tech. The other strain of thinking, and I think California Forever is a great example of this, is the institutions we have ain't working. We just got to completely bypass them and do something new. Get away from the old fusty institutions. This is kind of akin to the strain of thought I was talking about earlier with the John Perry Barlow goes, turns into Curtis Yarvin. But, California Forever is like, in a way, a lot of the people who are the backers and the guiding lights behind California Forever are also the people who were very active and vocal critics of San Francisco and its leaders and the state of San Francisco and the Bay Area, everything from the housing prices to traffic congestion to unhoused people on the streets. And California Forever is like, oh, you know what we're going to do? We are going to go to a, tabula rasa, so to speak. Although they're now realizing that Solano County is not actually a tabula rasa. There are people there. There's interest there. It's a little bumpier than they might think. But we're just going to start anew, and we're going to do something utterly different than what's already there. Like, you think it looks like this now? It looks like a bunch of, it's California arid grassland. Branch land? No, it's going to look like a Mediterranean town. It's going to look like the French Riviera, and I think those are very revealing. Like, you see these playing out in space. Like, how can we remake, use technology to make life a little better? And how can we actually just build completely anew? Another kind of techno-utopian urban experiment was the short-lived Sidewalk Labs experiment in Toronto, a waterfront neighborhood in Toronto, which sort of started off very, very techno-utopian with, I think there were flying cars. I mean, they got everything. It was pretty cool, the original mock-ups, and then kind of, met the realities of urban politics. And then you have kind of ideas like seasteading, which was floated by and backed by Peter Thiel again, and Milton Friedman's grandson was involved in it, which I just love.
I see what you did there, by the way, with that pun about floated.
You saw my punny before I saw it. So seasteading, like, let's go into international waters and just build something completely free from sovereign governments. But also it's, these techno-utopian ideas, I think they reveal, first of all, a kind of, in some sense, sort of a charming naivete about the way the world works and how things have evolved over time and why things are the way they are. They also are anti-democratic. They are kind of visioned from the top down and also are consciously or unconsciously designed for a pretty narrow demographic. And also thinking, well, who would actually want to live in these communities? Like, who would this attract? Who is this for? And I think there is this, this sort of earnest naivete, this sort of hopefulness about remaking society, kind of finding new utopian visions for what society can be. Also sort of presume that it focuses a lot on the good of humanity manifesting itself in these places and doesn't always acknowledge that the bad comes along with it. And I think this was also the conceit of Facebook, for example, connecting the world, and that this was going to be so good for humanity. And this wasn't just an idea held by Facebook executives. This was something widely held by everyone from presidents on down for once, brief shining moment. And no one's really stopped to think, if we bring humanity online, we're going to get all the good parts and all the bad parts too. Like, if we're going to get, the guys who are, the white supremacists who are kind of in their hollow, widely dispersed, and they're going to find a way now to have Facebook groups where they can, get together and storm the Capitol. And this techno-optimism sometimes can blind people to what realities are. And sometimes I would say it's a kind of a West Coast optimism too. It's sort of product of all of these, let's always remember that these products and tools that are used all over the world are things developed by very, groups of people in very geographically narrowly defined places. Mostly Americans, almost all college educated, privileged in different ways, disproportionately white and male, trained in certain disciplines and not others. And that leads to products that are, have a lot of blind spots in them. I'm a historian, so I'm not going to predict anything. I do past, not future. It is remarkable when you just reflect back a decade ago or a little more than a decade ago and how people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos were kind of regarded in the popular imagination and the public eye. and where they are now. It's just very, very, very different. And Elon Musk, too, Iron Man, he has a cameo in Iron Man. Yay, Elon, innovator, genius, the new Nikola Tesla. And now it's quite different.
This is a podcast about the potential for West Coast independence. If the West Coast were to chart a more autonomous path, what role would Silicon Valley play in shaping that identity? And maybe more specifically, what role would the sort of Silicon Valley oligarchy play?
Well, it's really interesting because a number of them are moving away from the West Coast because it's too blue and too many taxes. So you have Jeff Bezos has decamped from Seattle to Florida. Elon Musk has gone to Texas. I mean, they all still have houses everywhere. So what are we saying? But, there's this interesting migration away from these oligarchs have, migrated away politically and physically. I think the tech industry is still an enormous, enormous driver up and down the West Coast. And in some ways, it's not only the tech industry kind of classic, companies that their business is building computer hardware and software, but it also is, software has indeed eaten the world. It's every part of the industry of the West Coast is in some way connected. And one of the things that is, a hallmark of the tech industry is that it is an extraordinarily globalized industry in every dimension. It relies on foreign-born workers to a much greater degree than nearly any other sector, aside from farm working, but it's sort of foreign-born knowledge workers. It is an industry that has a global reach and depends on global supply chains. And it's an industry that grew up in an era not only of lower regulation and lower taxes, sort of the long Reagan era that begins in the late 70s and continues to today and is completely coterminous with the rise of personal computing and everything that comes after. It's like they're the same age. But also the era of global free trade and the free movement of people and capital across borders. And the nationalism of Trump and the new rising nationalism elsewhere in response to Trump, and also organically, is a threat to that model, that Silicon Valley model. So on the one hand, it's going to be, I can't imagine any scenario in which it wouldn't be an enormous engine and a shaper. And some of the leaders of these companies, maybe not the pro-Trump or oligarchs, but other, companies and their leaders kind of playing a big role, a civic role, kind of the Brad Smiths and Cascadia sort of role in the future. But also thinking about the West Coast not only as a sort of the western edge of North America, but the eastern edge of the Pacific, and how that is, kind of a critical part of a web of Pacific Rim trade that currently is being challenged and is disrupted. And so where does that go? Again, I don't make predictions. I'm a historian, but the current, it is pretty clear that, when I look at all of the things that are being very aggressively hacked away at in the first 100 days of the Trump era, Trump 2.0 era, and we still don't know what's going to happen next, but they are hacking away at the foundations of the American innovation economy that allowed it to be so dominant globally and to compete with any other challenger, first the Soviet Union, then Japan, and now China. And if American higher education and the immigration system and foundational research continues to be under attack, then this is the best present that Xi could ever have gotten. This is China's win. So that's also something for the east coast of the Pacific Rim to be thinking about as we're seeing potentially a pretty profound geopolitical shift.
Yeah, it struck me that, one shift we could talk about from the time that the code came out was that we've gone from having a tech sector to a tech economy and to it being truly a global tech economy. There is no separate finance sector. The finance sector runs on tech. That's going to happen in things that seem very manual, like farming or truck driving. I think your point about being the eastern side of the Pacific is really interesting. And given what you were saying about the role that kind of business opportunism plays in driving the politics of people on the West Coast and in the tech sector specifically, I'm wondering if the United States is going to start proving kind of bad for business for these massive global corporations. That's a thing to speculate about. But I guess the question for you is the notion of an independent West Coast or even a more autonomous West Coast, is that an idea that's time has come, or is that another example of techno-optimism that goes astray?
Look, history does show you that, one always has to be open to all kinds of possibilities, contingencies, and outcomes, right? There are a whole range of possible outcomes, and to rule one out because, oh, we never had done that before, that just seems so alien. Look, we were part of, part of Spain, part of Mexico. I mean, empires rise and fall. Territory, nation state boundaries are fungible and movable. It's so funny, one of the things after Donald Trump's first election in 2016, there were these kind of half joking, but not really proposals for California to secede from the Union. And here we are again. I think things would have to get really bad. And not to say that they wouldn't, but kind of the disruptions would have to be particularly to business enterprise, would have to be so profound. But there is I think it is worth the speculation is interesting when we think about how much, and this kind of goes back to how much policy matters to private enterprise, especially tech. And so even though Silicon Valley has kind of crafted a very compelling story about itself as a free market miracle, and even though some of the kind of anti-regulatory voices in tech leadership are like, government needs to stay out of the way. The reason we're so successful is government didn't mess with us. Mark Andreessen, the Andreessen Horowitz venture capitalist, Netscape co-founder, who a couple of years ago published this 5,000-word techno-optimist manifesto, which is just tells you a lot about a lot of things. But it kind of, is this sort of ahistorical sort of framing of what Silicon Valley is about. Like, government is an impediment rather than an assist. And the true story is that, to a degree much greater than others, why is tech on the West Coast in the first place? Cold War spending. World War II followed by Cold War spending. That is why electronics are in the Santa Clara Valley of California. It's 40 miles south of San Francisco. That is why they are there. Yes, there were a few garage startups. Hewlett-Packard predates that a little bit. But they were struggling until the money started flowing from the federal government, to be clear.
At the heart of the show is not just a what if about West Coast independence, but the idea of, what if the West Coast could start from scratch? So Margaret, what if the West Coast could start from scratch? Let's throw some ideas around.
That's some big thinking. It's so funny because I have such I think asking a historian that, we immediately start dialing back to like, well, but then there was the Spanish settlement and then there was this and this. We start thinking of all the historical layers that got the West Coast to where it is today. But, it is an interesting provocation. And I think that, one of the things is that, we are the West Coast of a United States that very much kind of took its cues from Europe, both from political ideas to transatlantic trade to kind of British North America set the tone. And then it was westward expansion to the, quote unquote, unsettled Western wilderness. And if the West Coast were to start from scratch, I think that the orientation would by necessity be profoundly different. Obviously, they're kind of the utopian things that I would like to see happen, and I think there are things also that Democratic lawmakers who have, ruled in West Coast states also, there's an opportunity to rethink and remake the way things have gone. West Coast cities have not been working for people. The housing crisis is real. Inequality is deep. Something that made cities like Seattle and San Francisco and LA such magnets for migration in the middle part of the 20th century, abundant housing, ease of transportation, abundance of jobs, quality of life, those things are really challenged. I mean, I think the thing that immediately comes to mind is, how can you make it so that people can, continue to live in the city they grew up in and buy a house there? How can you create escalators of upward mobility that are allowing people opportunity to become a high-tech entrepreneur or to buy a home or to realize whatever their dream is? And that dream was very much in the middle part of the 20th century alive, not alive for everyone, but alive for many. And we know what that can look like. And it does require more robust public spending and subsidy and investment that's broad-based, that people benefit from widely and is shared, where you sort of get a shared sense of purpose. And it is one that is really open to newcomers and change. And I think one of the big upsides of the West Coast And this is why tech took root here and flourished here, is it's a place you came from somewhere else and you were able to reinvent yourself and reinvent the possible. And really latching onto that and saying, how about let's not do the things the way we did. Let's recognize the existing institutions and let's make them better. Let's not be, irrational and utopian and say, oh, let's just build cities from scratch. Even California Forever is realizing that is not a feasible thing. You can't do that. There are Air Force bases and ranchers and, water rights and things that are in the way of that. And also the real meritocracy of, we don't really care where you're from. And if you have some good ideas and you want to play in this sandbox, come on in. And so how do we make that sandbox as open to as many people as possible and as a place where people can flourish?
That was Margaret O'Mara, historian, author, and one of the sharpest minds on the past and possible futures of tech, money, and politics on the West Coast. If there's one thing I'm taking away from our conversation, it's that the tools we built to liberate the world may now be reinforcing the worst tendencies of wealth, power, and control. And yet, we're still the region with the talent, imagination, and global reach to do things differently. So what if we stopped waiting for Washington, D.C. that is, and started imagining a governance model that matched our innovation economy and our values? It's going to take a lot more muscle and critical thinking from us, our elected officials, and tech leaders if we want our neighborhood on the West Coast to continue not only as one of the world's biggest economies, but an enviable place to live in the world. If that resonates with you, please share this episode and bring others into the Pacific Time conversation. Listen, follow, share, and drop reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Cast, or wherever you listen. Read and get in the conversation on Substack, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And let's keep asking the what-if questions about the future of the West Coast.